here for half an hour. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so as you know, Chen was the former head of global creative development for YouTube at Google, and now he's the co-founder and chief creative officer for his own startup called Victorious. He'll tell you more about his experience at YouTube, his company, Victorious, and the future of content, and anything else that you want to ask him. There'll be a question and answer after his time. So I wouldn't take too much of the time. I'll just pass it on to you right away.
Oh yeah, I'll stand. This is yes, we're just saying. It's such a privilege, genuinely, to be here. It's my first time in Jakarta. I'm sure you've heard that a lot, so sorry for being cheesy and cliche. But I know it genuinely is a big privilege. This is going to sound very elementary, but I first learned of Jakarta about 5 years ago when I realized you're the 4th largest population in the world. And also we realized that you were on the map at YouTube about 3 years ago when we saw the engagement was just spiking. So again, genuinely privileged to be here with all of you, especially in some of the future of the country, as well as broader. As Angeline mentioned, I figured I'd go over a couple of things. First and foremost, can share a little bit of how both Victorious and YouTube we sort of saw the world and how we built the now multi-billion-dollar creator artist ecosystem. If that's not interesting, I can skip that. You let me know with your eyes. All right, maybe. All right.
If it talks too fast in English,
Yes. Tell me to slow down. All right, I'll slow down now. Sorry. I'm from the South, so we talk, well, depending on who you are, we talk fast and we swear a lot, so you'll forgive me for both. But we can go through that. Third, as Angelina alluded to, I'm happy to share how we see sort of the world of content as well as sort of fan making sort of evolving. Naturally, some things will be more predisposed to the West as opposed to the East, but I'm sure there will be some corollaries. And then finally, can answer any question that you may have that maybe I could answer. Okay. So just to take a step back, I think the single greatest human-made, human-controlled problem in the universe is self-actualization and projection. In other words, how do you deliver the meaning of life to people faster and more deeply, right? It's regardless of what you read, whether it's Lockean or Ericksonian developmental theory, Elon Musk, and so forth, will all tell you that realizing who we are meant to be professionally, personally, and hobbies is the single greatest challenge. It's hard because we often lack resources to realize our ambitions. We're afraid, we don't have the financial capacity, we may not have the right friends or team, all the things you know very well, right? There are two ways that you can deliver, I think, the meaning of life to people. One is nature, and the other is, of course, nurture, right? On the nature side, that effectively is playing with someone's genetic makeup, which A, we don't understand enough of to do meaningfully, and B, depending on who you are, that's playing with something much greater than all of us as human beings, so we don't touch that. The second way you can solve this is nurture. How do you create an environment that's favorable or amenable to someone's growth? I'll give you sort of an example from the US. There was a sort of inner city segment of Western Philadelphia, which is sort of ripe with violence, it's generally lower income, generally sort of fragmented households, so forth and so on. They took a subset of those sort of young people and put them in a much more structured, slightly more affluent environment where they actually had more structured training and so forth. Those people were able to graduate at a higher rate from university, or at least enter university, than their peers. In other words, this says that if you take someone with unfavorable genetic makeup but put them in a favorable environment, you can literally turn their life around for the better, depending on how you define it, right? So one of the things that we were so excited about at YouTube in the early days is we look at YouTube as an environment or a world builder, right? How do you engage someone inside a place where they can realize every capacity of who they are, whether it's to be more beautiful through an artist like Michelle Phan, or to laugh by me getting kicked in the balls, so forth and so on, right? So that sort of is the top line philosophy that went into YouTube. YouTube as a platform evolved over the course of 5 years into sort of excuse me, that's the first curse word, into sort of cats on skateboards into, again, this sort of multi-billion-dollar, now 500 billion creative artist ecosystem. This happened largely because of 6 to 7 reasons. One is there is always a superfluous amount of creative talent. As you all probably know very well, there are only so many people you see on television or that get record labels like Agnes Monica, and that's a sort of an old trite system, right? You have to go through all these people who think they know what taste is, and then you have to sign a deal, and then maybe if you're lucky you'll get distributed. The reality is there are far more creative talent in the world, right? So that was the first. The second is there's far more and easier ways to distribute yourself, largely because of the disintermediation, the technology, and the internet at large have enabled, right? Whether it's through content platforms like YouTube or social networks like Facebook. Okay? Third is we also started investing in various training facilities, both online and physically, to help train people how you actually optimize your presence, how you actually create some richer content. Fourth is, by virtue of that, once you get trained up, how do you enter an enterprise ecosystem that can then sustain that creativity into a real career? This is where multi-channel networks that some of you may be familiar with, like Maker Studios, arose. This is where social media management tools arose, so forth and so on. Fifth is an abundance of capital that was injected in our ecosystem. This year alone, the amount of venture capital that was invested in new media companies doubled to over 600 million from about 280 million last year, and that hopefully will continue to rise. And then finally, six, which is at once the most qualitative and subjective factor, but I would also say is the most vital, is what we call sort of community building. So the idea is that if you go at something alone, it's lonely, it's scary, you may not have resources, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're able to join a Maloo, like Gepi, for instance, you join not only a streamlined education flow, but also others who you may be able to collaborate with as well. It's also important because it's a great retention tool for an industry, right? So the idea would be, if any of you have had to leave schools or change schools while you're young, it's infinitely harder if you have friends in that school, right? The school itself probably is, you're indifferent to because you learn the same thing everywhere, right? But it's the people who sort of make up the distinction. So those are sort of the top line 6 things of what rose to sort of YouTube's sort of, I guess, prominence. If you'd like, I can spend time on more specifically what we did and what we learned about creative artists, but if not, I can skip ahead to the future trends. Do you want me to spend time on the factors that went in, or how we built sort of YouTube into... Right. So the honest truth is YouTube started out in 2005, 2006, depending on how you slice it, right? YouTube more or less just sort of moseyed on its way for about 5 years. It had some sort of new tools and sort of new people and new creative artists that came to the platform, but we didn't really invest in the creative ecosystem until 2010. It's when I joined, it's when many people were brought in from traditional media. And to be honest, we had no idea what we were doing. We thought it was an interesting platform because, again, we believed that creativity was everywhere. We believed we had this global stage. We started to see palpable manifestations of that through individual channels. So an amazing beauty guru that felt very premium, an amazing musician, so forth and so on. So we started investing in them. We started throwing a bunch of stuff at the walls. This is, by definition, the way every industry begins. You start at random, and over time, you have an overabundance of randomness that then gets synthesized down to something more crisp. So the way I look at sort of the evolution of the creator ecosystem at YouTube is sort of in 2 or 3 phases. The first is between 2010 to 2012, the next is 2012 to 2014/15, and then finally it's 2015 and beyond. This is largely for sort of the bigger, sort of more mature markets, so again, there will be variation globally. This is generally how to think about it. So from 2010 to 2012, our priority was to understand what creators cared about. And when I say creator, I mean anyone who uploads content to YouTube. So you think about it in 3 ways. One is individual artists, like, do any of you know who Michelle Vaughn is? Yeah. Yes? Okay, Michelle Vaughn's like a makeup guru. She puts makeup on and stuff. She's now worth over $1 billion. We'll get to that in a moment. The second group are new media companies who create web-first content. These are your Maker Studios in the world. I'll get into how those evolved in a moment. And then finally is traditional media. So think of these as rebroadcasted studios and networks like the Walt Disney Company. We spent a lot of time over those 2 years trying to determine what do these people care about. And again, we threw a bunch of stuff at the wall. We thought about building our own studio spaces, building a physical gold play button as an expression of excellence, so forth and so on. And effectively what we learned after millions of dollars and too much time were that every creator, no matter who they are, cares about 6 things, right? In no particular order. First is fame. How do you build a large and engaged audience that can actually sustain your career, but also how do you achieve qualitative fame from it? Second is fortune. Fortune means 2 things. It's not just about earning a lot of money, it's about reducing your costs as well. So I'll give you some palpable examples of how we manifest these in a moment. Third is creativity or content. How do you produce a high volume and also quality of content that's amenable to your audience? Fourth is education. Do you actually have the skills to produce great music or great makeup tutorials, so forth and so on? Fifth is recognition. How do you actually get recognized or certified as someone who's excellent, whether it's based on your achievement or otherwise? And then finally, once again, this is the softest, but arguably the most important piece, is connection. How do you feel connection meaningfully with the platform that you're on, so you feel like I'm not just betting my career on some wall Wizard of Oz, but also how do you feel like you have a connection with the rest of the community because the internet's lonely, right? So I'll give you a few examples of the types of efforts that we initiated across all these, and then I'll synthesize into what we prioritize. On the fame side, so we thought about it in a couple ways. One is how do we grow audience? So we started to migrate fundamentally the YouTube platform success metric from a subscriber or view-driven metric to a watch time-driven metric, which effectively says, instead of saying how many people are watching you, we're going to focus on how much time they spend on you. Okay? We invested in a couple of other things as well, like how do you build richer relationships between a creator and their fan, partly because anyone who's a millennial or Gen Z, and in other words, anyone under the age of 32, cares about a deeper relationship with their audience and a two-way conversation. So there are a bunch of different social networking-like tools we invested in. And then finally, third, which is the hardest to crack, is qualitative fame. Right? So one of the big questions we asked ourselves in 2012 or so was, why is Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber, why are Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber fundamentally more famous than Michelle Pfeiffer? Why is that? And we effectively found that the disparity between a traditional celebrity versus a digital star is that I am aware of Taylor Swift and Justin Bieber even though I have not consumed their content. Whereas in order to be aware of Michelle Pfeiffer and her fame, I actually have to consume her content. Fundamental difference. It's partly because of just mass sort of macro awareness through billboards and TV shows and sort of the general milieu. But we started to invest there as well. So you probably started noticing we invested in a whole slate of qualitative efforts around the world to try to sort of promote digitally born stars on YouTube in traditional formats, billboards, television, film, and so forth. The second piece was Fortune. So one of my big babies was in 2011, we globally expanded the YouTube Partner Program. So we went literally from 30,000 creative artists on the platform to 4 million within 12 months. It was a third of revenue that year, and now it's sort of continued to accelerate to different screens like mobile. Being able to put money in people's pockets obviously matters, right? In that year, we expanded to thousands of people who were making six-figure US income on the platform, which we considered making a full-time living. Today, that number is more than double of what it was before. So starting to, again, inject more capital in the ecosystem is good. There was another team as well that started to invest in the venture capital community that, again, would additionally include more liquid inside the services that we already built. What we found, just to take a step back as a platform, is you constantly face this battle between, are you a scale platform that enables creativity, fame building, and fortune, or are you actually more of a studio content producer that helps produce these things? And it's a constant battle with any content-based social network. Facebook faces this, YouTube faces this, Instagram faces this. It's a challenge because, A, there are philosophical questions around, are you a platform versus a producer? There are also legal regulatory questions. If you suddenly become a producer, you suddenly are not exonerated on certain sort of issues, right? E.g. fair use. And then third is also sort of a capacity over core competency issue. If you're a technology company, do you actually have an expertise in content? One who speaks, bless you, viscerally would say no, right? So why would you focus on it? So effectively, the reason I mentioned this is we found very quickly that the two places YouTube could really, really move the needle were fame and fortune, and therefore that was the majority of our investment over the 5 years. The other four, though, were so important. So in terms of the content, we try to enable people to produce more content more quickly. One of the best ways, I don't know, do any of you make content yourself? Like, do you blog or do you make videos? People are being shy. Okay, so one person does. Yeah, all right, one celebrity here. So one of the hardest things about creating content is creative inspiration, right? How do you create something from literally nothing? So we try to invest in a lot of royalty-free content, like music that you can use in your videos that help accelerate the creation process. Also grant making, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We also, at a larger level, invested in studio spaces that are now global, I think in 6 different countries. But net is investing in content by definition is a very non-scalable effort. So it's actually very, very sort of counterintuitive to YouTube and Google's core DNA. So that was that. The fourth piece was education. So we looked at education in 2 ways. One is how do you educate people to be wildly successful on your platform, and then 2, outside of your platform, how do you educate them to also be successful? E.g., how do you produce good music, right? The first piece we owned. The first piece absolutely we sort of invested in through scale research online and elsewhere. The latter was a little bit harder. So that was that. And then on the recognition connection side, I'll speed through those. We had a host of different sort of efforts there. So those are sort of the 6 factors that we learned, sort of people cared about between 2010 and 2012. During 2012 and 2014, we realized that the world started to take YouTube creators very, very seriously. They started to rise in fame. For instance, one of the biggest stars in India right now is Lily Singh Superwoman, who is not from a Bollywood film or an actress. She's instead a video blogger from Canada, right? And so that sort of is when the market started really responding, and therefore we started to see a lot of enterprises really gain prominence. This is when you saw a lot of the acquisitions of the new media companies by the bigger media companies who are trying to figure digital out. This is when you start to see a lot of the venture capital arms start to very seriously invest in digital media, so forth and so on. which of course fast forwards us to 2014, 2015. The industry, for better or worse, is now entering sort of college or maturation phase, where you see a lot of sort of the old media models, whether it's traditional content formats or traditional players like managers and agents, start to enter our space. It's good because it legitimizes the space. It also helps add additional business opportunities. It's a con because some of it feels like we're going a little bit backwards. We're becoming the system that we fought against so hard, right? The old narrative was you don't have to go to the studio to become famous, and now we're becoming that system. So there's a lot of sort of strife right now in the industry around it. So that's effectively the 6 factors that sort of we learned throughout YouTube. Let me talk a little bit about sort of the big trends we see. And again, we say they're global trends, but that's probably being ethnocentric. They fall into 2 different buckets: content and community. In other words, creative and sort of audience. Sometimes people add a third, which is commerce, but candidly, I think a lot of us are a similar age. If you do monetization properly, monetization done properly actually disappears inside content community. It amplifies the experience you're having rather than interrupting it. In other words, for instance, some of you may use Line, for instance. Lines like stickers that you can purchase and so forth is good monetization. That is done properly, right? A pre-roll ad or an ad that's in between your video is a shitty monetization system, right? It just interrupts your experience. It's counter to what our generation cares about, so forth and so on. So there are 10 trends total in each of these buckets, or in these buckets. On the content, let me make sure I don't miss anything. On the content side, the first one I call is niche is now normal. So you will know this very well, but we are all nuanced human beings with nuanced interests. So I'll give you an example. I love R&B music. Do any of you like R&B music? Okay, sweet. All right. So if you like R&B music, there's a lot of R&B music, right? So A is, I like Jodeci, which I think is older than all of us. But Jodeci was like in the 80s, and they're like real R&B music, like old, slow R&B music. And then I love Chris Brown, right? I'm sorry, ladies, for like Chris Brown the music, not the person. But Chris Brown is arguably pop. He's not even R&B anymore, right? These are 2 very different forms of R&B, and we all have different versions of this ourselves, right? Not all of you just like comedy films. You might like a specific kind of comedic film. Because of the internet, because of large platforms like Spotify, YouTube, and so forth, you can now get access to those nuanced content interests. What that means is the rise of niche content, or big niche content, has suddenly emerged. So let me give you a few examples. How many of you like electronic dance music? No one. Oh, okay, the one star here. Okay, two people are shy about electronic music. It's okay. We won't judge you for it. Electronic music is a big niche. There's an enormous diaspora that loves this. Look at Europe every single month with another festival, right? But it's not as mass market as Justin Bieber or Taylor Swift. Once again, because of platforms like Spotify and so forth, and SoundCloud, you can now get access to sort of EDM. If you look at the United States, one of our favorite sort of stats is every single year for the past 5 years, indie music label gross revenue has grown. Whereas for the last 5 years, the largest major label, Universal's market share, has actually dropped, right? Now, what this means is not that an indie label musician like my mother and her ukulele is making more money than Adele. That's not what that means, right? But it does mean, though, is that tastes for niche content are rising in aggregate and suddenly becoming more interesting, right? Because once again, not everyone just wants to listen to Adele's album, which is awesome, by the way. But you don't just want to listen to that all the time. You might want to listen to the next Adele that hasn't been signed yet, right? So that's one data point. Another one that you see, partly because of the import-export opportunity, is big niche sort of verticals, like Nollywood content or Asian content. So Nollywood, how many of you know what Nollywood is? All right, one person. The ones, you are the A+ student. So who is the largest or most prolific, producer of premium content in the world? What country? It's close by. Guess. You look like you might know. It's India, it's Bollywood. Right? So they produce more content at a premium production level than any other country in the world, right? Who knows what number 2 is? You said it like 2 seconds. It's Nollywood, it's Nigeria. Okay? It's harder than Lagos. Now most people write off sub-Saharan Africa because they think, oh, Africa is poor and they don't have it. It's not true, right? There's an immensely rich, almost like romantic comedy-like ecosystem called Nollywood in Nigeria. It's partly because the content's good. It's also partly because of the Nigerian diaspora. Roughly about 14 to 16%, give or take, the African diaspora globally is Nigerian, which already has an incredibly built-in or engaged built-in audience, right? So you see Nollywood content starting to rise. Asian content's another great example. Who knows who the most subscribed to, in other words, most popular YouTube star in comedy is globally? Guess. PewDiePie's a good guess. PewDiePie's like a gamer comedian. Smosh is another good guess. Smosh, all right, I'll give you Smosh. Smosh, depending on who you ask, is right. So if you look at true pure comedian, because Smosh is debatably web series as well, it's Ryan Higa. So Ryan Higa is a Japanese Hawaiian, right? And you look to the United States, roughly 30%, or excuse me, 3% of faces on television are Asian, right? It's very, very low. It's lower than the average population, right? Rather, the ratio of the population. Ryan has, for the past 5 years, dominated the comedic charts, and he does not look white. He's not white, right? And it's because of the export potential of his content. It's also because his content's very good. So you can slice niche however you like, whether it's vertically based, demographic based, and so forth, right? So that's the first trend. The second trend is mobile-first formats, right? I don't need to tell all of you this, but mobile, of course, in every screen historically has effectively dictated what the new content format will be. I'll give you an example. And I'm sorry for evoking a U.S. example. This is all I know. In the 1950s, when World War II ended, the United States invested an enormous amount of money in producing content. It's all propaganda content to get the country excited, right? When the war was over, it was like, oh shit, what are we going to do with all this equipment now? So they brought it back and they started investing in TV shows. Those first TV shows in the middle and end of the 1950s were basically a talking head to the screen. The reason why this was twofold. One is all the companies, or most of the companies that owned the television companies were the radio companies, which was the dominant content platform to date. The second reason this happened is because that's all the public knew. So they literally translated the talking head version of radio to television. Okay? And then over time, of course, you saw this evolve, right? You see this with every single major screen. People try to reappropriate the existing format for the new one. You're seeing it on YouTube as well. The dominant format on YouTube is the same exact thing. It's called the video blog, or the vlog, where you have a head talking to a screen, right? So too now, we have mobile as a new format. And so people are trying to figure out what is that first mobile format. A lot of people, especially in the West, are investing in mobile video because they think, oh, the engagement's so high, my carrier loves it because they get more money, so forth and so on. The challenge is, by definition, this is a very snackable small device. So the likelihood of you watching a half-hour video on this device right now is actually very low. So I think where the most interesting opportunities are on the content format side for this device is actually in the image and text-based world. So one of the greatest things that Instagram in particular has done is they launched a campaign a month ago called My Story, where they actually try to reimagine the comic book through images, right? Much more consumable, still highly interactive. So I think those who are trying to start to invest on the mobile-first content format on the basics, text and image, are probably the ones that are increasingly most interested. That's not to say mobile video is not important, but it is to say that image and text should not be overlooked, right? The third trend in content I call phoenixing. So phoenixing, so too as a bird rises from the ashes, so too is how do you take existing old content and make it new again? So I'll play a game, for instance. Tell me what percentage of content that's viewed on YouTube on any given day, what percentage of that content is over a year old? In other words, it's old. Versus new content. Guess. There is a wrong answer, but we won't false you for you. Guess. Just guess. 80 is very high, but good guess. One more. One else guess. How many? 4? All right, so we have two different sides of the spectrum, right? So it's 4%, 80%. Who thinks who's right? If you think 4 is right, raise your... Actually, no, we won't do that. I don't want to make you guys feel that. So the answer is 60%. Okay, so it's kind of in between, skewed towards you, right? But the idea is that's an enormous amount of content. In other words, most content that's viewed on YouTube is old, period. The reason this is so interesting is because every major content platform is investing in new content because they think that's actually what's most consumable. But by the numbers, that's actually not true on the biggest content platform, YouTube. Right? So the trick is, how do you take library content that's old and repackage it so that it becomes new again? There are a couple ways you can think about slicing this. One is temporality. So the idea is, what's your birthday, sir? What's your birthday? Yeah, your birthday. Oh, so April 10th, or 10 April, right? So let's say on April 10th, when you go to Facebook, Facebook will serve you up something interesting. It'll say, here's your birthday, and here's what you've done on your birthday every single year. That's an interesting way to repackage old content and make it new again, right? So temporality becomes interesting. You can also do non-personal temporality. So BuzzFeed, are you fans of BuzzFeed? I don't know if BuzzFeed's here. Okay, all good. All right. BuzzFeed is like, I don't know how to describe BuzzFeed. BuzzFeed is a waste of time. B is wonderful though. But BuzzFeed basically creates a bunch of, they're famous for their listicles, so they make like the top 10 or top 11 of blank things. And they're often comedic, sometimes sort of thoughtful and sentimental, so forth and so on. But they do this phenomenally well, where they take universally applicable themes and start to create lists out of them by resurrecting old content. So that's the Phoenix piece. The fourth trend in content is at large curation, right? Curation I think of in sort of two ways. One is structured, produced curation, and the other is unstructured curation. One of my 3 favorite content companies in the world is called Chen Media. They own basically every viral video you've ever seen in your life, right? So if anyone ever gets kicked in the balls, or there's a double rainbow, or there's a baby that is playing with a cat on a piano, they probably own it 99 out of 100 times, right? And they own it globally. Chen Media is incredibly interesting because they effectively take content from the crowd and in structured fashion repackage it so that it's something premium and interesting again, right? This is interesting because A, there's an enormous and in theory infinite amount of content from the crowd because there are so many of us, right? The trick is just how do you make it more interesting and more premium. You see on many platforms this notion of sort of crowdsourced content really bubbling up. So on Victoria's platform, on our platform for instance, even though it's driven by celebrities and film franchises and sports leagues, 96% of content created and consumed on our platform is actually user-generated content, right? And that's partly because it's so good, it's also partly because there's so much, right? So that's encouraging. The second place in curation I think is far more interesting. It's crowdsourced structured content. So instead of having a Chen Media new media company that makes the new content, how do you empower the crowd to create it themselves? The best way that you see this right now is through collaborative gestalt. So in other words, how do we all collectively come together and create something new that is interesting? So how many of you are on Snapchat right now? All right, so some of you. Some of you are also time wasters. There you go. So have you played with Snapchat stories? Yes. All right. So the idea of Snapchat stories is collaborative crowdsourced storytelling, right? So an example would be, I come to Jakarta, right? And I see on my Snapchat profile there's Jakarta, and everyone can upload content about Jakarta. They stitch it together in this beautiful way that shows all the things we're doing in Jakarta, okay? There are 2 ways that collaborative storytelling will work. One is by similar interest, and 2 is by similar proximity, right? At YouTube and Google, we invested, I probably shouldn't be saying this, but we invested a lot of time trying to figure out how do you bring people together through a social network? Why does humanity convene globally? And there are 2 reasons. One is similar interest. You and I may love Chris Brown, for better or worse. Or 2, by proximity. We are in Jakarta together. People convene for those 2 reasons. So one of the most interesting ways you'll see Snapchat stories is, again, proximity or location-based. It could be an event, it could be a city, and then also by similar interest. For example, maybe there's like hashtag best friends forever, and you can upload your own permutation of that. Okay? That's the 4th trend. The 5th trend is what I call universe building. So we'll play a game again. Who knows what the most lucrative content franchises in the world are? In other words, if you were to take a film or a TV show, which ones are worth more money than any other in history? Good. Games? Close. Be specific. Like what types of games? What's a type of brand? Okay, so closer. Yeah, RPG is right. Even more specific. If you were to say like Zelda, for instance. You're cheating now. That's a good guess though. I'll come back to you in a second because you're very right on the MMO piece. We'll come back to that. Other guesses? Most lucrative content brands. There are wrong answers, but try anyway. You 2 want to guess? Let's see. Guess. Just guess. One way to think about it is what content brands do you see more often than any other over time? Good boy. Star Wars is number 1. Well done. Star Wars is the most lucrative content franchise in history, right? The second is guess. Second/3. Guess. Warcraft's a good guess. Warcraft's a really good guess. It's not second or third, but it's definitely a good guess. One more? Well done. It's Harry Potter. And then third is arguably James Bond, though it depends on how you slice that, right? All of these content franchises are not just films or books. They are continuous multimedia experiences that are cross-platform. There are films that become TV shows, that become consumer products, they become a theme park ride, they become other universes as well. Marvel Cinematic Universe, DC Cinematic Universe, Star Wars, Harry Potter, these are all the best examples. That is how content is supposed to be had, not by individual formats. So one of the big farces of the digital media industry is everyone thinks, oh, we need a new House of Cards, we need a new TV show, or we need a new album. That's not the way content should be invested in. Again, it should be holistic. So those who can understand how to navigate multiple platforms and create a true content universe, A, is you in theory can streamline your production costs across all the platforms, and B, is you're able to be more ubiquitous for your fan base. Okay? So those are the content trends. Let me go to community trends and then we'll fast forward. I can tell we're all tired. On the community side, there are also 5 trends. The first is what we call zero-click access. Okay? The less you can, the fewer barriers rather that you can have between you and what you love, the more likely you are to consume it. So let me analogize this to how Google's top line strategy. How many of you use Google search? All right, so only 4. That's cool. All right, so Google search is still the world's biggest search engine, right? And Google really sort of made its business on the search engine. The question after search was, all right, if we want to sort of have every touch point on the internet, what is a layer deeper beyond the search bar that we can own? The answer was, of course, the browser, right? Because you have to have a browser in order to have a search engine. Enter Chrome, right? Or Google Chrome. How many of you use Google Chrome? Okay, so 4 of you again. Cool. All right, so what is then, so we'll play a game. What is beyond the browser then? So it's like you have the search engine, you have the browser. What's the step beyond that? Good boy. It's connection, right? And connection means a couple things. One is the OS, right? Enter Android, enter Chrome OS. And then fourth is the actual connection itself. Enter Google Fiber or Google Fi. It's this easy chronology where you go backwards, 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 so you disintermediate access to the content, right? Content is the exact same way. So in 2012-ish, we saw viewership migrate from televisions for people under the age of 30 to desktop, right? Because their content was being syndicated through Netflix and YouTube, as well as other platforms. Today, you see the majority, over 60% of engagement on platforms like Facebook and YouTube on a mobile device. So once again, instead of having to open my laptop, I can now just open this thing that I can easily bring anywhere. What is the step beyond mobile? I'll give you the answer. So actually, I'll give you a couple answers. So one is we're largely in still an app-based environment on mobile, right? Thank you to Apple, right? And debatably others, but largely Apple for mass marketing it, right? What the step beyond a app-based mobile environment is a non-app-based mobile environment, which is why you're seeing many of the large OSs, perhaps scarily so, trying to invest in you not having to click on an app to actually enter its environment. You can instead get access to the app's content by never going inside the app. So that's the next step that we're starting to see. The next step after that is me having to pull out my phone and turn it on is 2 clicks. 1, 2. That's annoying, right? So this is where wearables start to become interesting. Wearables is I don't have to pull out of my pocket like my watch. This is not a smartwatch, by the way, but I can just look down, turn it on, that's 1 click, okay? The next step beyond the 1 click is the 0 click. So 90% of our content is consumed through our eyes, right? This is why things that are based around the eyes are so interesting, right? Now, if you wear something on your head, you'll look like an idiot right now. So we have to figure that out. But that's the next step. Then the step beyond that is how do you have to have nothing on your eyes at all if something is just sensory-based interesting. This is where you start to have the non-headset-based VR experiences or virtual reality experiences. So again, in terms of 0-click access, you'll start to see this crescendo, or decrescendo rather, right, into 0 clicks from the 2 that we're at today. The next theme is Pareto's Law. Who knows what Pareto's Law is? Pareto's Law is the 80-20 rule. The idea is that 20% of your audience or 20% of the world drives 80%. So for better and worse, 20% of the world actually controls 80% of the world's wealth, probably for the worse, right? You also see us on content-based platforms like YouTube, Facebook, and so forth. 20% of viewers or users always drive 80% of engagement or revenue, right? When you go to actually certain genres on YouTube, you actually see that number exacerbate. So example, you mentioned PewDiePie earlier, right? PewDiePie is a gamer on YouTube. Or you mentioned PewDiePie, sorry.
No problem.
The other A+ student. So PewDiePie is like a gamer, right? When you go to gaming content on YouTube, 5% of viewers drive 65% of gaming viewership. So if you can take that 5 to 20%, you've suddenly taken most of the engagement, which is very powerful, right? So how do you invest in these super fans in more interesting ways? This is why you're starting to see a lot of platforms like ours sort of rise. You're also starting to see big niche platforms like Crunchyroll and Drama Fever take shape, and they can financially sustain themselves because they only need a small number of people to supplant them. You see this also in the music industry. This harkens back to the music labels, right? One of the laws in music is you'd rather have 100,000 fans that will pay you $1,000 every year than 1 million who will pay you $1. And the reason why is you do the math, it nets out to the same amount of money. The former, the 100,000 fans, are much more loyal, so you can upsell them and engage them in more interesting ways. The third trend in community building is community and passion graphs. So you think about this evolutionarily. Early on, or late 1990s, early 2000s, the internet was largely ruled by the information graph, right? Because we didn't have access to all the same information. That was disintermediation by platforms like Google, Alta Vista, earlier stage, so forth and so on. That then migrated into the social graph, which is the mid-2000s. These are your Friendsters, MySpaces, Facebooks, and so forth, right? We're now entering or have arrived at a phase we call the passion graph. So the idea is that your identity or livelihood as a human being is not necessarily based on the information you have access to or the friends that you're associated with, but rather the things that you love, right? The things that you are attracted to, your interests, your passion of other human beings, right? And the notion is that we're all A, multiply interested in multiple things. B is we may be interested in things that our social graph or information graph are not actually aware of. The best platform that's sort of at mass scale that represents this is Instagram, right? Instagram is a passion graph, right? You can like things like designers or art or naked supermodel or whatever you want, right? And you can do so potentially secretly, right? So that's sort of the third trend. The fourth trend is export-import. So again, we talked about Nollywood earlier, and I don't need to tell you this now, but the world is much smaller than it used to be, right? So being able to export content, import content is interesting. If you were to look at YouTube, this happened effectively 2013, 2014. 60%, 60% of a individual uploader's audience comes from outside of their origin country. Meaning, if I'm Indonesian and I upload content, 60% of my audience is not in Indonesia. Right? And it's because of the mass scale of YouTube, it's also because of the Indonesian diaspora, it's also because the content just travels much better than it did historically. You know very well, you are not your parents, you are much more worldly than your parents were, you're in a much more connected world than your parents were, and so you're, not only do you crave access to that content, or crave access to things abroad, you now have the ability to do so. Right? And finally, and this is, I'll end with the softest bit, but arguably the most important piece, a lot of the youth of the world right now is incredibly jaded. So you look especially at the under 25-year-olds. This is for a lot of reasons, but the principal one was a lot of our parents were raised in the 60s, which is post-World War II. Depending on what side you were on, you either had a great future or a terrible future, right? But a lot of the world did have a good future from that, right? Our parents, were sort of imbued with the victory of World War II, so they had a lot of confidence. That injects a lot of capital, a lot of new jobs, and therefore they believe that anything is possible. That sort of emotional, cultural sensibility then gets strung down to you as their child. They tell you that you can indeed achieve anything if you're confident, so forth and so on. And again, there's variation country to country on this, but largely this is one of the big trends. The challenge is because of the global economic recession, and not only in 2001, but more importantly in 2008, and also one that is continuing to this day in certain countries, we have an enormously high and unprecedented number of unemployed youth who are told that they could do anything. Right? So you have these people who you're built up your entire life for 18, 20, 21, 25 years, and then you're sorely disappointed by the real world. So what this means is a lot of us are now sort of facing this challenge of why do I exist? I was told all these things and it feels like they're a lie. Right? It feels like the world I was promised does not actually exist. And this is more true than it's not. I'll give you an example. In the United States, during the height of the economic recession, unemployment for people my age was 40%. On average, it's 20%. So it's double more. Right? It's an enormous problem. Enormous problem. So one of the big sensibilities that, again, is very qualitative is our generation is increasingly looking for meaning. You're trying to find out not only why you exist, but what your impact and legacy will be in the world. By the way, if you extrapolate that more broadly, it's something we all care about, but our generation especially because of the macroeconomic factors. So what this means for content community is no longer can you just have content or fans that are delightful and fun. They actually have to be very authentic and represent something much more layered, something much more meaningful. Right? So that's how we sort of see the future. Future of content communities. And with that, I've talked way too much at you. Hopefully that was helpful and somewhat interesting, and if not, I'm very sorry for wasting your time. But I'm happy to answer any questions about that or sort of my own startup experience for better, or for lack of better. Yeah.
And what time do you have to go?
8.
8. Okay, so you guys have 20 minutes
8-ish.
for Q&A.
I'm so curious. So all of you are entrepreneurs, yeah? Or no? Yes? Oh no, okay, wait, so, all right, I'm gonna single people out. If you're an entrepreneur, raise your hand. And are you guys largely tech entrepreneurs, or? Awesome, okay, sweet. And then if you're not a tech entrepreneur, what are you? Not to say you are defined by your job. What do you do spending most of your waking hours? Or if you guys are just bored on Tuesday. What does everyone else do? Sweet, what do you do? Oh, sweet. Oh, so you're like in the ecosystem then. So we should be thanking you for that. Cool. That's awesome. Cool. So yeah, happy to answer any other questions. We're done. Sir.
I actually have a lot to ask, but let me just.
Well, no one else has a question, so you might as well go.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to revert back to your point for community future trend number 4. Which is export-import,
Yep.
which you said that roughly around 60% of the viewer of our content is came from other places that were not. I want to ask, is it happening? Globally? Do you think it's globally or this is just or in each country like this? Because You see, our barrier. I'm one of the web series maker, and
Cool.
Our barrier is mostly is the language,
Yeah.
right? Because when we create the English language content, then well, it attracts the audience from outside of our country, but we don't attract our own content, audience, but, and likewise. So what I want to ask is actually this has something that related to the what kind of contents.
Yeah.
Like if we're talking about the future of contents,
Yeah.
what should we prepare?
Yeah.
Like is it local? Is it local content is better to reach our audience, or should we aim for the like global content to reach bigger audience?
It's a great question. So I think about it in sort of probably 5 ways. The first is, and this will sound soft, but you should always be authentic to yourself as an artist, especially because of how connected the world is. So even if you make something that's very hyper niche, there will be an audience for it. I'll give you an example. So I made a comment like 4 years ago on this panel for YouTube that there's literally a channel for everything on YouTube. I didn't actually know that was true. I was totally full of shit, right? Because I was like super young. But so someone in the audience who was an asshole said, sorry for cursing, yelled out, what about iron skydiving? Meaning you skydive and you iron clothes while skydiving, which is enormously dangerous, by the way, right? So I thought, fuck, like now we have to find this. So we pulled up a laptop and we typed in iron skydiving. You can look further yourself. There's a channel on YouTube called Iron Skydiving. It has 100,000 subscribers, and their videos get a few thousand views. So there is really something for everyone. Okay, so that's number one. It's qualitatively as an artist, you have to be authentic to yourself, but also practically there is an audience somewhere. It's just a discovery question, right? The second thing I'd say is 60% is global average, but we do see that trend in most major countries that are connected to YouTube with some intensity. So it is fairly consistent depending on where you are. The final 3 things I'd say though, and this more directly answers your question of the type of content you think about, is I think about sort of export and import in 3 ways. One is language, 2 is cultural context, and 3rd is evergreen. So naturally certain languages will translate better because the diasporas of their adoption is more aggressive, right? So if you were to speak Spanish, for instance, there is a meaningful diaspora for Spanish, right? Whether it's Castilian or not, right? The 4th is culture, right? As we all know, just because you translate something does not mean you have localized it to a certain country. Moreover, just because you are not in the same country does not mean you don't share the same culture. So one of the running jokes in the United States that, I hope this is not really recording, I'll get in trouble for it, is the Jews and the Asians are the same, okay? Because we both, I know I'm gonna get in big trouble for saying this, but we both care about education, we care about family values, we are fundamentally different people from different places, but we have very similar cultural values. So there are different ways you can slice cultural alignment. The 5th and final answer is sort of evergreen content. So naturally, you would suspect content that traverses the globe very well is A, non-language specific content, e.g. if you see me get kicked in the balls by my mother, that's probably funny to everyone around the world, right? Or if you see a cat play a piano, that's probably interesting to everyone in the world. There are segments of that work well. Pets, babies, etc. work really, really nicely. And I'll extrapolate that a little bit. If you look at certain like universalities on the content side, those naturally translate well. So I'll give you an example. The 2 universal signals of beauty are symmetry and neoteny, right? So if you look at the most beautiful people in the world, they're actually not like Victoria's Secret supermodels from, I don't know, Brazil, right? They're actually those with truly symmetrical faces or neotenous faces. Neoteny is, think about it as like a baby. When a baby is, I don't know how many of you have seen a baby be born, but when a baby is born, their face is really circular, right? And they have a very small button nose, they have very big bulbous eyes. Universally, anything that's born, right, whether it's a lamb or a dog or a baby or whatever, looks neotenous. It's why Mickey Mouse, you'll notice over time, if you look at how Mickey Mouse's face has evolved, moved from a very pointy, almost rat-like face to a very neotenous face. It's very round, button nose, bulbous eyes, right? So those are the 2 universal signs of beauty. That's why categories like pets, especially young pets and babies, translate so well, because they align with that universal sense, right? There are other ways to think about content that translates really well universally are utilities. So I know you all know this, I was talking to Angelina about this earlier, but utilities like beauty and fashion translate very well, because everyone wants to be beautiful, and you don't necessarily need to talk to understand how to put makeup on or how to have cool clothes. Auto translates very, very well internationally. Fitness translates very, very well. So again, utilities that are endemic to our beings as humans translate really nicely. Things that don't translate well, comedy translates very poorly, unless you're like, kick me in the balls and you think that's funny, right? But it doesn't translate well for all the reasons you know, right? There's a lack of true cultural context that makes comedy interesting. So that's how I think about it.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
So you incubate talent, right? And Google. How do you do that? Do you get maybe elaborate on that? How do you pick and then how do you train them?
So I think about it in 3 ways. The first is we, as with all big platforms, segmented out what creators we cared about, right? So we sliced this in a million ways, but the top line way was how much engaged audience do you have on YouTube? If you have more engaged audience, we care more about you and we'll invest in more, because the more time they're spending with you means the more time they're spending with us, means the more money they're giving us, right? So we segment out everyone. As with most platforms, there are 3 different segments. There's a head, there's a torso, and a tail. The head are the smallest number of creators, but drive a disproportionately high amount of engagement. Generally, what you find on social content networks, Facebook, Instagram, and so forth, is that the head is less than 1% of your total base, right? Meaning users, but often drives, depending on who you are, 20 to 40% of your engagement and revenue. The torso and tail then naturally make up the rest, right? The tail is by far the biggest. So YouTube, the tail is 99 point whatever percent, right? It's literally hundreds of millions of channels, but it accounts for roughly 40% of engagement and revenue. And then the torso is the difference, right? So that was first and foremost. We tried to decide, all right, who exists out there, who do we care about? The next step, or the second piece, is then, all right, well, what degree of service do we actually want to provide to ensure that their ROI actually makes sense? If you are a 1,000 subscribed channel, actually that's a bad example. If you're a 10 subscribed channel, you are in the tail, right? It's not to say you're not important or you're crappy, it's just that you're not important or as important yet, right? And so we had a whole slate of services and strategy that were very low effort, more like a fixed cost upfront sort of approach than what we do to invest in the head. So a few examples are, we would say, all right, within education, one of the 6 pieces that I mentioned earlier, we'll give you a self-serve playbook of how to be successful on YouTube. There's a high upfront cost, or relatively low upfront cost, but there is an upfront cost nonetheless. We'll invest in that there, and then we'll be hands-off over time. Whereas for the head, we'd overinvest over and over and over again, right? The third piece then is honestly very qualitative. So as with all things, there are 2 ways to approach sort of content curation. It's first a science and then art. Science meaning numerically who actually has a large and engaged audience in this right country, that's a priority for a company, in the right category or vertical, like beauty or music that's important to us. And then secondly is use your curative eye. I'd say YouTube still to this day is not perfect at sort of human curation because we're just not artists, it's not a core competency. It's something that YouTube's trying to build up a capacity of. I'd say to invoke a former sort of competitor, Instagram does this phenomenally well. Instagram's human creation is incredibly robust and working apparently phenomenally well for them. But that's sort of how we thought about it. And who knows if it worked? I guess platform-wide it worked. So the way that we evaluated our success was A, is the engagement or watch time actually rising? It did indeed. B is, are people able to make a financial living on YouTube, and is their revenue actually going up per channel? The answer was yes. And then third is qualitatively in the industry, is our content being taken as seriously as traditional content from sort of awards and so forth? And the answer is once again yes. So that's how I thought about it.
Maybe one last
I have
question.
one more question.
One last question.
You look familiar. She looks familiar. Don't worry, she's not here.
Actually,
Yeah.
I'm not really from this tech world part, but I'm just curious, like, in the beginning, how do you market your platform? I mean, it's not happen just like that, and everyone knows your platform, right? Like, it's how in the first place to market it, if we create something.
So the easy answer is it depends on the platform, right? It depends on the audience you care about, the reasons you care about, the services you can provide, so forth and so on, because every platform is different. The way that we think about the Victorious platform, and this is one of the good tricks to it, is we don't face a cold start problem, right? Because we only work with those with heavily engaged existing audiences, so it's merely about migration, which has proven successful. So our platforms are very large despite only being 7 months out the gate. So that's how sort of we thought about it. Outside of that, again, it really depends. I'd say just top line strategy is A, you have to have a good product. The best